The hardest choices a man makes are the ones no one ever sees. Marcus Hale sat perfectly still in the stiff plastic chair outside room 214, his hands resting on his knees, dried streaks of dark red tracing the lines of his knuckles like something he hadn't had time to wash away. The fluorescent lights above humming low and indifferent, casting a pale glow across the empty hallway where time seemed to stretch longer than it should, longer than it ever had, and yet not long enough for a father who couldn't stop replaying the last hour in his head. Not in full, never in full, just fragments, broken pieces, the sound of tires against pavement, the weight of a small body in his arms, the way his son's jacket felt too thin for the cold, and how instinct moved faster than thought, faster than fear. Because fear came later, it always did, but in that moment there had only been one thing that mattered, and he had chosen it without hesitation, without calculation, the way men like him always did when it came to their children. He blinked once, slow, his eyes fixed on the closed door ahead, the small window revealing nothing but shifting shadows and the occasional silhouette of movement, voices muffled behind it, clinical, controlled, a world that spoke in numbers and charts while his world sat on the other side of that door breathing in uncertain rhythm. He exhaled quietly, not a sigh, just air leaving his body, as if even that required permission now. Down the hall, a nurse paused, her eyes lingering on him for a second too long before moving on, not unkind, just unsure, because men who looked like Marcus, work boots still dusted from a long shift, jacket worn at the edges, hands that told stories no one asked to hear, didn't usually belong in places like this unless something had gone wrong. And something had, though no one had said it out loud yet. Not to him, not directly, and that silence carried its own weight, heavier than words, heavier than blame. A security guard near the entrance shifted his stance, glancing over, then away, the kind of glance that measured without speaking, that categorized without asking. Marcus didn't respond, didn't meet anyone's eyes. He just sat there, steady, unmoving, like if he held still long enough the world might settle around him again, might make sense again, but it didn't. It never did that easily. The seconds ticked by on the clock above the hallway, each one louder than the last, until the sound of heels echoed softly from the far end, precise, controlled, not rushed, not uncertain, and the air changed before she even spoke, before anyone turned to look. Evelyn Cross walked into the corridor with the kind of presence that didn't demand attention but received it anyway, her coat draped perfectly over her shoulders, her posture straight, her gaze sharp and observant as it moved across the room, taking in details, categorizing, assessing. She didn't slow until her eyes found him, the man sitting alone outside room 214, hands still marked, clothes still carrying the trace of where he'd been before this place, tried to clean everything into something acceptable, something presentable. She studied him for a moment, not long, just enough, then glanced toward the door, then back to him, her expression unreadable, not cold, not warm, just precise, like she was placing him somewhere in a mental file he didn't know existed. Marcus didn't look up right away, but when he did, it wasn't with defiance, not even with expectation, just awareness, quiet and grounded, the kind that didn't ask for permission to exist. And for a brief second, something unspoken passed between them, something small, almost invisible, like the pause before a question neither of them had decided to ask yet. The doctor came out without drama, without urgency, just a quiet push of the door and a tired breath that carried more weight than any words he might have chosen, his eyes scanning briefly before settling on Marcus. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because sometimes the space between people says more than language ever could. Then the doctor gave a small nod, the kind meant to steady rather than reassure, and said that the boy was stable, that he needed rest, that they would keep him overnight for observation. Simple sentences, clean and measured, but Marcus heard the only part that mattered, stable, and his shoulders lowered just slightly, not relief, not fully, just enough to let air back into his chest. He stood slowly, as if remembering his body again, his boots pressing softly against the polished floor, and for a second he glanced toward the door, but he did not move closer, not yet, like crossing that threshold required something more than permission, something internal. The doctor spoke a little longer, explaining procedures, forms, things that needed signatures, and Marcus listened without interrupting, nodding once, twice, his voice low when he finally responded, steady, respectful, asking only what he needed to know and nothing more. No complaints, no demands. Just a man trying to understand the rules of a place that did not belong to him. Behind them, Evelyn had not left. She stood a few feet away, silent, observing the exchange with the same composed stillness she carried into every room. But there was a shift now, subtle, almost invisible, because she had expected something else, something louder, something less controlled. She had read the initial report before arriving. A man involved in an incident, a risk taken without authorization, a decision that had complicated more than it solved, at least on paper, and paper was what she trusted, numbers, facts, patterns that made sense when people did not. But the man in front of her did not fit cleanly into that frame. When the doctor handed Marcus the clipboard, he took it with care, his fingers adjusting their grip, so the dried marks on his skin would not smear onto the paper. A small movement, easy to miss, but deliberate. He read each line before signing, not rushing, not hesitating, just present in the moment in a way that felt almost out of place in a hallway built for urgency. When he finished, he handed it back with a quiet thank you. Not performative, not seeking acknowledgement, just a habit. The doctor nodded and moved on, leaving the hallway to its low hum again. Marcus remained standing for a second, then finally stepped toward the door, pausing just outside as if listening, not to voices, but to something deeper, something only he could hear. His hand lifted slightly, then stopped, hovering, before falling back to his side. He closed his eyes briefly, just one breath, then opened them again. And that was when Evelyn spoke, her voice even, controlled, cutting through the quiet without raising itself, asking if he was the boy's father. The question simple, but the way she asked it made it something else, not doubt, not exactly, but an evaluation. Marcus turned toward her, meeting her gaze directly, no defensiveness, no submission, just clarity, and answered yes. One word, grounded. Enough? Evelyn studied him for a second longer, then shifted her weight slightly, her eyes flicking once more to the door behind him before returning. And in that moment the hallway felt different, like something had begun, though neither of them had said enough yet to name it. Marcus did not look away, and that in itself was an answer Evelyn was not used to receiving without resistance or performance. Most people either over-explained or shrank under her attention. But he did neither. He simply stood there, steady, as if her presence did not change the weight he was already carrying. And for a moment she let the silence stretch, measuring it, testing how long he would hold it without filling it. Then she asked what happened, her tone neutral, not accusatory, not sympathetic, just precise, the kind of question that expected a clear account. Marcus glanced briefly toward the door again before answering, not avoiding, just grounding himself. And when he spoke, his voice stayed low, controlled. He said his son had been with him after school, that they had been crossing the street when something fell off, not something he could explain, just instinct, and he trusted it. He moved when he needed to move. He acted before thinking about consequences, because there had not been time for anything else. He did not dramatize it, did not add details to make it sound bigger than it was. He just stated what he did and why. And then he stopped, as if that was all that mattered. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in disbelief, but in calculation. She had seen reports where people justified poor decisions with emotion, with panic, but his words did not carry panic. They carried certainty, and that unsettled her more than anything else. She asked if he understood that his actions had created complications, legal, procedural, things that ripple outward in ways most people do not consider. Marcus nodded once. He said yes, that he understood, and there was no defensiveness in it, just acknowledgement. She tilted her head slightly, studying him, waiting for something else, an excuse, a request, an appeal for understanding, but none came. So she asked why he did not wait for proper assistance, why he chose to take control of a situation that was not his to control, and Marcus took a breath before answering. Not because he was searching for words, but because he was choosing them carefully. He said that sometimes waiting is a luxury, and sometimes it is a risk, and when it comes to your child, you do not measure the difference the same way. The sentence hung between them, simple, but heavier than it sounded. Evelyn's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, a fraction, barely visible. She had built a life on measured decisions, on calculated risks, on systems that worked because people followed them. And here stood a man who had stepped outside those systems without hesitation, not out of rebellion, not out of ego, but out of something she could not quantify as easily. She crossed her arms lightly, not defensive, just contained, and said that intentions do not always justify outcomes, that responsibility does not disappear just because the reason feels right. Marcus nodded again, accepting the statement without argument, then said quietly that he was not asking for anything to disappear. He was just there to make sure his son was okay. And that was where his responsibility started. The words landed without force, without challenge, but they held their ground. Evelyn watched him for another second, then glanced down the hallway where staff moved with quiet efficiency. Her world, ordered, predictable, controlled, then back at him, a man who had disrupted that order in a way that could not be ignored. And for the first time since she arrived, she did not immediately categorize him, did not file him into a clear box of right or wrong. Instead, she paused, just slightly, as if the equation in front of her had introduced a variable she had not planned for. The silence did not break. It shifted, subtle but undeniable, like something invisible had been placed between them and neither of them had decided yet whether to move around it or through it. Evelyn lowered her arms slowly, her posture still composed but no longer entirely distant, and for a brief second her gaze softened, not in sympathy, but in focus, as if she had decided to look closer instead of looking past him. Then she asked what he did for a living, the question simple on the surface, but layered underneath. Marcus answered without hesitation, said he worked maintenance, long hours, steady work when it was there, and when it was not, he found something else. He always did. His tone carried no complaint, no self-pity, just fact. Evelyn nodded once, processing, her mind already mapping out patterns, income stability, liability, decision-making under pressure, the kind of silent calculations she had built her world on. Then she asked who was taking care of his son when he worked, and this time Marcus paused, not because he did not have an answer, but because the answer required context. He said that he adjusted his schedule, nights when he had to, early mornings when he could, that his son stayed close, that he made it work, the way people without options learn to do. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly again, not in judgment, but in recognition of something inefficient, something that did not align with structured systems. She said that unpredictability like that creates risk, especially for a child, her voice even, almost clinical. Marcus listened, then nodded once more, accepting the statement as true without accepting it as a solution. He said that risk is not always something you remove. Sometimes it is something you manage, and sometimes it is something you accept because the alternative is worse. The words were quiet, but they did not bend. And for a moment Evelyn had no immediate response, which was rare. She shifted her stance slightly, her gaze drifting past him to the door again, then back, and this time there was a different kind of attention in it. Not just assessment, but curiosity edged with something harder to define. She asked if he had insurance. The question sharp, practical. Marcus answered honestly, said not enough, not the kind that makes situations like this simple, but enough to get through. Somehow, the word somehow lingered longer than the rest. Evelyn noticed that. She always noticed the words people chose when they were not trying to impress anyone. She took a slow breath, then reached into her coat pocket, pulling out her phone, her thumb moving quickly across the screen, sending a message without explaining it, without asking permission, a decision made in seconds the way she always made them, controlled, decisive. But when she looked back up at him, she did not explain what she had done. Instead, she asked one more question, quieter now, almost conversational. She asked if he would make the same choice again, knowing what it cost, knowing the complications, the consequences that followed. And Marcus did not hesitate this time, not even for a breath. He said yes, just one word, but it carried everything. No justification, no defense, just certainty. And that certainty landed differently than anything else he had said. It did not challenge her. It did not ask for approval. It simply existed, unmovable. And for the first time since she stepped into that hallway, Evelyn did not try to measure it, did not try to reduce it into something she could control. She just stood there, quiet, looking at a man who had made a decision she would never make the same way, and yet could not dismiss, because something about it refused to be small. The hallway settled again, but not in the same way it had before. Something had shifted beneath the surface, quiet but persistent, like a question that refused to disappear once it had been asked. Evelyn slipped her phone back into her coat without breaking eye contact, her expression composed, but her thoughts moving faster than she allowed them to show. She was not a woman who acted on impulse, not in the way most people understood it. Every decision she made had layers, reasons built on data, patterns, outcomes she could predict before they happened. But this moment did not fit neatly into any of those structures, and that unsettled her more than she would admit. She took a small step closer, not invading his space, just closing the distance enough to shift the dynamic. Then she spoke again, her tone measured but carrying something new beneath it. She said that certainty like his can be dangerous, that people who refuse to question their choices often fail to see the consequences until it is too late. Marcus listened, his posture unchanged, his hands now resting loosely at his sides, the tension in them easing just enough to show that the immediate fear had passed, but not the weight of everything else. He nodded once, acknowledging her point, then said quietly that doubt does not always make better decisions. Sometimes it just slows them down, and when time matters, slowing down can cost more than being wrong. The words were simple, but they did not challenge her directly. They existed beside her argument rather than against it, and that made them harder to dismiss. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked past him again, toward the door, as if trying to see beyond it, beyond the situation, into something broader. She was used to evaluating people based on what they could offer, what they could contribute, how they fit into the system she controlled. But Marcus did not present himself that way. He did not position himself as someone seeking approval or opportunity. He stood as someone who had already made his choices and accepted their cost, and that made him difficult to influence in the ways she understood. A nurse passed between them briefly, offering a polite nod, the kind given out of habit rather than recognition. And when she moved on, the silence returned again, heavier now, more deliberate. Evelyn broke it with a different kind of question, one that did not belong to business or liability. She asked what his son's name was, and for the first time, something in Marcus shifted visibly. Not weakness, not hesitation, just a softness that had not been there before. He said his name was Caleb, and the way he said it carried more than the word itself. It carried history, responsibility, something rooted deeper than circumstance. Evelyn noticed that. She always noticed the moments people revealed without intending to. She repeated the name once, quietly, as if testing how it felt, then nodded slightly, her gaze returning to him with a different kind of focus, not just assessment now, but intention forming beneath it. She did not explain what she was thinking. She rarely did. Instead, she let the silence settle one more time, then said, that situations like this do not resolve on their own, that someone has to decide what happens next. Her words precise, controlled, but carrying weight. Marcus did not respond immediately. He looked toward the door again, then back at her, and said that he was not asking for anything to happen next. He just needed his son to be okay. The answer was not what she expected, and that was exactly why it stayed with her. Because most people, when faced with someone like her, would have seen an opening, an opportunity, something to gain, but he did not reach for any of that. He stayed exactly where he was, focused on what mattered to him and nothing else. And in that moment, Evelyn realized something she had not planned to consider, that testing a man like this would not be simple, because he was not trying to win anything in the first place. The word testing lingered in Evelyn's mind longer than anything else he had said, not because he had spoken it, but because he had made it unnecessary. And that was what caught her attention. She had spent years building systems that revealed people under pressure, contracts that exposed intentions, negotiations that stripped away pretense. But Marcus stood there without any of those layers, already revealed in a way that left little room to manipulate. And yet she knew better than to trust. First impressions, she always did. She took a slow breath, then shifted slightly, her tone returning to something more structured, more familiar. She said that whether he asked for it or not, outcomes still required direction, and sometimes the difference between stability and collapse came down to who made the decisions. Marcus listened, his expression unchanged, But his eyes sharper now, more aware of where the conversation was moving, she continued, saying that his situation was not just about a hospital visit, that there would be follow-ups, bills, schedules, disruptions that would extend beyond tonight. Each one small on its own, but significant when combined. She did not say it as a warning, but as a fact, something she expected him to understand. Marcus nodded once, his gaze steady. He said that he had been through disruptions before, that life does not wait for things to be convenient, and that he would handle what came next the same way he always had, one step at a time. The answer was simple, almost too simple, and that was exactly what made Evelyn pause again, because it lacked strategy, lacked the kind of forward planning she relied on, but it did not lack confidence, and that confidence was not careless, it was grounded in experience. She studied him for a moment, then made a decision, small on the surface, but deliberate beneath it. She said that she could arrange for his son to receive continued care without delays, better access, better resources. She did not elaborate on how. She did not need to. The implication was clear. She was offering a solution that most people would not refuse. Marcus did not respond immediately, and that hesitation was not about temptation. It was about consideration. He looked toward the door again, then back at her, and asked what it would require. The question calm, direct, not suspicious, just precise. Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. She said that it would require cooperation, that certain protocols would need to be followed, certain decisions made with a broader perspective in mind. She did not say control, but it sat beneath the words, implied. Marcus heard it, not in the specifics, but in the tone, in the structure of the offer itself, and for the first time, he did not nod right away. Instead, he let the silence sit between them, longer than before, as if weighing something that could not be measured easily. Finally, he spoke, his voice still low, still steady. He said that he appreciated the offer, that he understood what she was trying to do, but that he would not agree to anything he did not fully understand, especially when it came to his son. The words were not a refusal, not yet, but they were not acceptance either. They set a boundary, clear and unyielding. Evelyn watched him closely, and something in her expression shifted again, not frustration, not approval, something more complex, because most people would have accepted immediately, would have trusted the outcome more than the terms. But he did not. He held his ground without raising his voice, without challenging her authority, and that made the moment sharper, more defined. She gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, then said that understanding takes time, but decisions do not always allow for it. Her eyes holding his, waiting, not pushing, but not retreating either. And for the first time since the conversation began, it was clear that this was no longer just an exchange. It was the beginning of something structured, something intentional, a test forming not through declaration, but through the choices that would follow. The space between them held, not tense, not broken, just defined now, like a line drawn without needing to be pointed out, and Marcus did not step across it. He did not lean into the offer or away from it. He simply remained where he was, steady, present, and that stillness carried more weight than any argument could have. Evelyn noticed it, the way he refused to be pulled forward by urgency or pushed back by pressure. And for a brief second, she allowed the silence to stretch without filling it, watching, measuring not his words this time, but his restraint. Then she spoke again, her tone slightly lower, less formal, but no less controlled. She said that hesitation can cost opportunities that do not come twice, that people who wait too long often find themselves choosing between less favorable outcomes. It was not a threat, not directly, but it carried the edge of one, the kind that lived in reality rather than intention. Marcus heard it clearly. He always did. He had spent enough years navigating situations where words meant more than they said, where tone mattered more than content, and he nodded once, acknowledging the truth in what she said, but not surrendering to it. He said that not all opportunities are meant to be taken, that sometimes the cost is not in what you gain, but in what you give up without realizing it. His voice remained even, respectful, but there was a firmness in it now that had not needed to show itself before. Evelyn's eyes held his for a moment longer, and something behind them shifted again, not irritation, not approval, something closer to recognition, because he was not rejecting her, not fully. He was defining himself in a way that made rejection unnecessary. She adjusted her posture slightly, her gaze flicking once more toward the door, then back. And this time when she spoke, the structure of her words changed, less explanation, more intention. She said that if he wanted full transparency, then she would give it to him, that the support she was offering would come with oversight, with involvement in decisions that extended beyond immediate care. She did not dress it differently now. She named it control, not as a demand, but as a condition, and the words settled between them with clarity. Marcus did not react immediately, but something in his expression shifted, not resistance, not surprise, just confirmation of what he had already understood. He took a slow breath, then said that he could not agree to that. Not when it meant someone else having a say in choices that belonged to him as a father. The words were calm, not defensive, but they did not leave room for negotiation. And for the first time, the direction of the conversation changed, not because one of them pushed harder, but because he chose not to move. Evelyn watched him closely, her mind already mapping the outcome of this decision, the limitations it created, the consequences it would bring. But beneath that, there was something else now, something less predictable, because most people would have found a way to compromise, to adjust, to meet her halfway in exchange for what she could provide. But he did not. He held his position without raising his voice, without needing to justify it beyond what he had already said, and that made the moment sharper, more defined than any negotiation she had handled in a boardroom. She gave a small nod, not agreement, not concession, just acknowledgement, then said that decisions like his shape what happens next more than any external factor, her tone returning to something neutral, controlled again. But the space between them had changed. It was no longer about an offer waiting to be accepted. It was about a boundary that had been set, and for the first time, Evelyn did not try to move it. She simply stood there, looking at a man who had chosen certainty over advantage, and realizing that whatever came next would not be something she could design the way she usually did. The boundary remained, clear and unmoved, but something beneath it shifted in a way neither of them could ignore. Not a break, not a compromise, just a quiet recalibration of how they saw each other. Evelyn did not respond immediately this time, which was rare, her silence no longer a tool but a pause, a moment where calculation met something less precise. She turned slightly, her gaze drifting down the hallway where movement continued as if nothing had changed, nurses passing, monitors beeping. Softly behind closed doors, a world that ran on routine and protocol. And yet in this small space, something had stepped outside of that rhythm. She looked back at Marcus, and for the first time since the conversation began, her expression held less certainty, not confusion, but a recognition that the situation was no longer as simple as she had initially framed it. She stepped back half a pace, not retreating, just creating space, and said quietly that most people would have taken the offer. Her tone not judgmental, just factual. Marcus gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but in understanding of the truth in her words, then said that most people are not him. The sentence landed without weight, without pride, just clarity, and that clarity lingered longer than anything else. Evelyn studied him again, but this time there was no attempt to categorize, no immediate placement into a system of value or risk. Instead, there was observation, unfiltered, and in that observation, something shifted deeper, because she realized that his refusal had not been about rejecting her power. It had been about protecting something she had not accounted for, something that did not translate into contracts or conditions, something rooted in a role she had never had to define for herself. She glanced once more at the door, then did something small, almost invisible. She reached into her coat again, pulling out a card. Simple, understated, no unnecessary details, just a name and a number. She held it for a second, as if considering whether to offer it, then extended it toward him without explanation. Marcus looked at it, then at her, not taking it immediately, not out of distrust, but out of habit. He did not accept things without understanding them. Evelyn noticed that hesitation, and for once, she did not interpret it as resistance. She said that it was not an offer, not a condition, just access, something he could use or ignore, entirely his choice. The words were different from before, stripped of structure, stripped of expectation, and that difference mattered. Marcus held her gaze for a moment longer, then took the card, his fingers careful, deliberate. as if acknowledging the weight of even a small gesture. He did not thank her right away, not because he was ungrateful, but because he was processing, deciding where this fit in what he had already chosen. Finally, he gave a slight nod, quiet, respectful, then shifted his attention back to the door, drawn there not by urgency, but by presence, by the simple fact that his son was on the other side of it. Evelyn watched that shift, the way her presence became secondary without effort, without intention, and something about that stayed with her more than anything else he had said, because it was not a statement, not a position, it was instinct, and instinct could not be negotiated. She let her hand fall back to her side, her posture returning to its usual composure, but the space around her felt different now, less controlled, less predictable. She turned slightly, as if preparing to leave, then paused for just a second, her gaze resting on him one last time, not measuring, not testing, just seeing. And in that moment, she understood something she had not expected to learn in a hospital hallway. That influence did not always come from power, and respect did not always follow position. Sometimes it came from something quieter, something that did not ask to be noticed, but changed the way you looked at everything once you did. The hallway grew quieter as the night settled deeper into itself, the kind of quiet that did not feel empty, but full of things left unsaid. Marcus stood there a moment longer after Evelyn turned away, the card resting between his fingers, light, almost weightless, and yet it carried a presence he could not ignore. He looked down at it briefly, then slipped it into his jacket pocket without ceremony, not acceptance, not rejection, just placement, something to be decided later, something that did not belong in this moment, because this moment belonged to something else entirely. He turned back toward the door, and this time he did not hesitate, his hand reaching for the handle with a steadiness that came from knowing exactly why he was there, not for outcomes, not for negotiations, just for his son. The door opened softly, revealing a dim room where machines hummed in quiet rhythm, and there, in the center of it all, lay Caleb, small against the white sheets, his breathing even, his face calmer now, untouched by the noise of decisions made outside. Marcus stepped in slowly, closing the door behind him with care, as if even the sound of it mattered. He moved to the side of the bed, his steps measured, his presence grounding the space rather than disturbing it. For a moment, he just stood there, watching, not checking monitors, not analyzing anything, just looking at his son the way only a father does when everything else fades away. Then he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against the blanket, adjusting it just enough to sit right. A small movement, almost automatic, but precise, intentional. He pulled the chair closer and sat down, leaning forward slightly, his forearms resting on his knees, his eyes never leaving Caleb, the world outside the room, the hallway, the conversation, the offer, all of it softened, distant now, not gone, but no longer in control of this space. Outside, Evelyn paused at the end of the corridor, her steps slowing without her deciding to slow them. Something pulling her attention back, not physically, but mentally. She glanced over her shoulder, toward the door that had just closed, and for a second she stood there, still, her mind replaying the conversation, not the words, but the moments between them, the pauses, the choices that had not been influenced by pressure or advantage. She had seen confidence before. She had built her world around it. But this was different. It was not confidence in outcome. It was certainty in principle. And that was not something she encountered often. She turned fully this time, her gaze resting on the closed door, and for the first time in a long time, she did not try to predict what would happen next. She simply accepted that it would not unfold on her terms, and that realization did not frustrate her. It grounded her in a way she did not expect, because somewhere between the offer and the refusal, between control and stillness, she had seen something that could not be measured, something that did not need to prove itself to exist. She exhaled slowly, then continued down the hallway, her heels softer against the floor now, less sharp, less defined, as if even the space around her had adjusted. Inside the room, Marcus remained exactly where he was, not moving, not speaking, just present, his hand resting lightly near Caleb's, close enough to feel, not close enough to disturb. And in that quiet, without any declarations, without any visible change, something had already begun, not in the form of a deal or an agreement, but in something far less obvious, A shift in how two people would carry this moment forward, one through action, the other through understanding, and neither of them would say it out loud, but both of them would remember it, long after the hallway returned to normal and the night gave way to morning, because some choices do not echo loudly. They settle quietly and change everything.